Thanks so much, everybody, for coming. Thanks for having me. Thanks to all organizations. It's really an honor to be part of this special meeting, and then we're in the presence of not only the current Motivation Society president, the incoming one as well. There's lots of exciting luminary people here. So, in contrast to what Chuck showed, which is super highly theoretical and very much conceptually driven, ours is a rather data-driven project that involves testing a couple hundred people and asking them about what their desires are as they walk around in everyday life. And the project came about because Wilhelm Hoffman here, who's the lead author on our papers, he and I were having drinks one day in Utrecht, and we started asking whether we even know about how people experience desire in their everyday lives. And so he went and learned all this experience sampling technology and statistics, and off we went. And so the project that we have was published in a couple of papers here. We continue to kind of milk the data set into some low-level health publications if you're interested in further ones. And then these same colleagues and I, we have a new set of findings all about what people think about in their everyday lives. And so trying to get a sense of whether people in that project are focused on the present, the future, or the past. In large part. So I can talk about that more later, but for the motivation meeting, I'm like, okay, I think we should talk about urges and desires and how people experience them, and then whether they lead to behavior or not. And so we had these kind of really just very basic questions about how do people's desires map out, what do they desire. We measured conflict with people's goals. It's actually kind of hilarious. We would ask people do you have a desire at this moment? And then they would tell us, and then we'd say, does that desire conflict with your other goals? And then they would tell us, and then we would say, are you going to try to resist the behavior implied by the desire? And people were like, nah, it does conflict with my other goals for sure, but I'm not going to try to resist it. Maybe it just was surprising to me people's reactions, but I guess in some sense it does make sense. And we wanted to know, so we considered resisting the urge as a way to kind of model self-control in this process, but we know it's not the entirety of what self-control means. But for just kind of for ease of presentation, I'm going to call that self-control, which is this resistance attempts idea. And then we have a bunch of personality factors and then other situational factors. Hat tip to Barry. This is one of my favorite cartoons that Barry once gave me. We're essentially kind of looking at this. I should have said this cartoon is the genesis of this entire project. We've all been there. We've all been there. We might be there right now. Okay, so here's what we did. We actually literally did have to give these people little PDAs because we did this project 5 years ago. And so we just want to make sure everybody had all the software and all the updated stuff. And now Wilhelm has developed protocols that you can use that just get delivered to people's smartphones, so it's super easy and amazing. And we have all these Germans who are helping us out in this project. Our current project on thoughts is an American sample. I don't think we see much differences. We have this amazingly high response rate because of our very compliant Germans, I think. When you do these samples, this is crazy high response rate. And so, in essence, we had most people, most of the time, responding to 7 beeps, for 7 days in a row. So we have a wealth of data, so much stuff. And then we told people that they could respond to the questions by indicating up to 3 desires, but the modal desire, if they said that they had one, was 1. So people, when they experience desire, seem to be focused on sort of one thing that's capturing their minds and bodies. And this is the kind of thing that we would ask them, and building these protocols is kind of interesting. So first we're just do you have desire now, or within the last 5 minutes? That's how we defined it. And so you get this yes or no. And then we would say, how strong is your desire, 0 to 7? And we labeled 7 irresistible. It turns out actually people try to resist irresistible urges all the time. So even urges that are labeled as irresistible by our own participants, they later then, just a couple seconds later, would say, yeah, I'm trying to resist this. And then we had these domains, these macro domains, which then further broken down into subcomponents of many, many other domains. And so I have a few of those data here. And then we would say, does this conflict with your other goals? Yes or no? And then if so, yes. And then we would say, are you going to try to resist the behavior implied by the urge, yes or no? And then we would say, like, did you actually then perform the behavior implied by the urge? And then we have, like I said, we have a bunch of personality measures, and then we have a couple of other things too, like, are you drinking right now? Turns out to be a fun little moderator, which we find later. Are you in the presence of others? And in particular, we were interested in this latter version of it. So once they said presence of others, yes, I'm with other people, then we would say, are you with other people who are doing the behavior that is linked to your urges? And that also turns out to be an important factor. Of our personality traits, I'm going to focus on these. We actually didn't take too many more than this. We thought trait self-control would be like a big player in all of this because we're interested in urges and their regulation. Turns out not to actually be the kind of player that we thought. Perfectionism, we conceptualize as basically wasted or squandered self-control. Perfectionists have crazy high standards. They're working very hard to achieve them, not always all that successfully, so we kind of thought that they might, highly perfectionist people might show different patterns here than others. We have entitlement. Like, you think you deserve good things in life, and maybe you're not going to try to resist the urges if the urges are, something that you think that you want to indulge in. And then, hat tip to Chuck, we have this mess. Here are our desire domains at that first pass. So we had like all kinds of basic things relating to just like human physiology, food, sleep, getting something to drink. I needed water earlier, so now I have water. Tobacco, alcohol, you can see it. Media turns out to be a big one. This paper got some press reports, and the findings were like, Facebook harder to resist than smoking. Which is actually true, that is actually our data. Our data will show that people give in to urges to engage in media. Even when they want to resist them, they give in more than they do with the same kind of situation and tobacco use. Or whatever that means. Hygiene related, go in the bathroom, things like that. Okay, so then if you break it down, food has a lot of urges around it, and then sleep. I think sleep is super interesting, and these data in this project have really brought that to the fore. People experience sleep-related urges all the time, and they're trying like crazy hard to resist them, and they mostly are successful in resisting them, but I think it's an interesting variable that probably takes a toll and colors people's everyday self-regulation activities to a much bigger extent than we really realize. As I said, media use. Like, media use comes in right after basic biological drives. Like, that's freaking crazy to me. Hanging out, leisure, hanging out with other people, so like having fun and leisure, and so on. So coffee and alcohol, not all that commonly reported, and so of interest perhaps. And then we tracked it. You can kind of see if you're interested in these kinds of things. Eating shows regular patterns of basically of hunger and urges. People want to drink alcohol at night, and especially as we get towards the weekends. Coffee has a big spike on Monday morning. Sex drive also seems to have some regularities, a little bit more on the weekends, and media as well. And then we have like spending. Actually, the data over here, I find this kind of interesting. So in Germany, like the shops are just not open on Sundays, and so you see this total flat bite on Sunday. So then when you don't have the opportunity, you don't have the urge. I think that that's also something, well, or maybe I'm just naive and not really with the literature, but I think that's something that we don't really talk about or know that much, about how much opportunity stimulates desire. And then social contact, very regular. And then sleep, look at this. Look at all these for sleep. People are just reporting having a lot of sleep-related urges. Again, to me, that's an interesting surprise. So we did it like this. Wilhelm loves to make these amazingly cool graphs, and it's kind of fun. But so let me walk you through this one for me. So you see here, so we've got desire strength and then conflict here. And then you get frequency of the desire being reported is like the size of that big old circle or not. And so here, again, sleep is popping out, higher in conflict, higher in desire strength. But like, look at like tobacco, media, I mean, they're not like super strong in terms of desire strength. Alcohol, the same thing as well. So we're actually trying to use these data and think about what does it mean for like models of addiction. If people don't report having these very strong desires for it, we wonder if it has to do with people just kind of eventually giving in out of habit or out of increased opportunities, like so that your social situation sets it up so that other people are drinking or other people are using tobacco, and so after a while you just do it too. But it's not born out of some like deep desire to use tobacco or to use alcohol. We had 10,000 reports of desires. We had 10,000 reports, and out of those we had 7,800 desires. And when we just simply asked people at any given moment, are you experiencing a desire or not, it was 49.5% of the time they said, yes, I'm experiencing desire. So half of the time in our waking hours, we have a desire going on inside of us. And then you can see that, that they resist like more than a third of the time. And then conditional on resistance, people do extremely well not enacting the behavior. So like that's also, I think, really neat. It's like willpower really works. And over here, even if they're not resisting the desire, sometimes they actually don't even get to go through with the behavior. We think in part because like someone else says no, or there's not the opportunity to do so, or plans all of a sudden have changed, like it starts raining outside. And so it's not like there's this clear path that just because you have a desire and you're not gonna try to resist it, doesn't necessarily mean you're still gonna perform the behavior. And so from this, we would say it's very much a sign for willpower and the potential for willpower to change behavior. And I already had these figures on the previous graph. And so we can see self-control, at least in this form of resisting desires, is highly successful. Moving on here, we have a graph of how much people failed at resisting their desires when they tried to. And so when things are in red, it's just like at the mean. And when things are in orange here, then they failed at that resistance attempt. And this is why you get this like Facebook more addictive than tobacco. That's where that came from. It's like work and media people give into more often, even when they're trying to resist those urges. Okay, and so we had people tell us a little bit more about their desires in some cases. And if you have a desire, it's only gonna last like 15 or 20 minutes. And then I already talked about the fact that some people do report their behaviors as being irresistible. And I'm just going to show you briefly here, those tended to be sleeping and sex. So sex wasn't actually mentioned all that often in terms of frequency, but when it was more commonly to be mentioned. It was more common to be mentioned in terms of a very strong desire for sex. Here, if people were mapping here, what happens when you have a very strong desire, and how will it predict behavioral enactment? And here it divides very easily by whether people are resisting or not. And so if you're not trying to resist the desire, and then you can just perform the behavior, there's sort of like desire strength doesn't really come into the picture here. But if you're trying to resist getting into an urge, and the urge is very strong, you're just much more likely to be unsuccessful there. Okay, and so now we're going to move to our model. This is our model that we use to try to figure out how these variables work all together in their entirety. And we mapped it out like this. You've got desire strength, which we thought the stronger it would be, then the more you'll enact the behavior. I already sort of figured to make that point. And then if you experience conflict, you're going to bring online resistance. To the extent that you bring online resistance, you will not perform the behavior implied by the urge. That's the idea. I only want to point out one thing here, is that desire strength and conflict are just totally unrelated. These things are independent factors. So you can have a strong desire that conflicts with your other goals, and you can have a weak desire that conflicts with your other goals. And we see all representations of those relationships. And so our theory was like this, is that some of these early stage ideas here, like, oopsies, like conflict and, it's even my own clicker. Even these, thank you. Oh, I got it back. So, we thought the personality variables would have a role over here in terms of what we call the inner part of it, like how much desire strength do you have for any given moment or desire, and then how much does that conflict with your goals. But then, like, as you move towards enacting the behavior and the factors that predict that, we thought that might be predicted more by some situational features. And so this is what we ended up finding. I'm going to highlight a couple of things here in bright light. So we thought about trait self-control, and we thought about trait self-control as being a big predictor of successful resistance of the urge. And that is not at all what we found. So what we found is that high trait self-control people, they experience less conflict with their desires, and they actually don't resist all that much. It's kind of crazy, but they also have less, like the desire strength is lower to begin with. And so we're kind of now thinking a lot about what is trait self-control doing in people's everyday lives, and our new conceptualization is that trait self-control is offense. It's like playing offense, not defense. And so in some of these papers that we've had coming from these data, what we find is that people with high trait self-control, they don't do any better at resisting their desires. They just avoid having the desires to begin with. They organize their lives so that they don't have the experience of those desires. As a consequence, their lives are amazing. But conditional on their experiencing desire, they look just the same or possibly even worse than some of the low self-control people. And that's our new conceptualization of trait self-control. Perfectionism has a lot of conflict, a lot of desire strength, and then a lot of resistance all involved. So like highly perfectionistic people are just like using a lot of self-control a lot of the time to deal with very strong urges. And so it'd be kind of fun to think about how you can use some interventions for those folks to think about using their energy a little bit wiser. Entitlement just leads simply people to say, I don't need to, these don't conflict with my other goals, I deserve this. Very straightforward. And then we find with BIS-BAS, we have like all these very, I thought, nuanced theories about how BIS-BAS would work, but in the final analysis, what you see is that people with a high approach drive, they have stronger desires. And as a person with a high BAS, I totally understand that. and then people with a high BIS component, they simply just don't perform the behaviors all that often, which I think lines up extremely well with what Chuck was talking about earlier. All right, and then just kind of externally, we did a paper for Say Science where we were actually able to figure out a depletion score in the wild. What we did is we modeled how many times people were resisting their desires, and then we weighted it by like how close in time was going to be the outcome measure we were taking at that moment. And you can see that when people's desire, so this is desire strength over here, this is their depletion score over here. If they've already been using self-control to resist their desires, and they've done it a lot throughout that day or that period, then when they have a current desire and they're trying to resist it, it's not that successful. So here we feel like we have some of the very first evidence of depletion outside the laboratory in the wild. It's just very hard that when you've been using self-control a whole lot, it's just extremely hard to keep using it. When other people are doing what you crave, it's very hard for you to keep resisting your urges. And so we see behavioral enactment go way up when you're trying hard to resist your urges, but there's like other people around doing exactly what you want to be doing. Again, by the way, this kind of reminds me of like our trait self-control people. They probably do a good job of avoiding being in those situations where other people are doing the things that they crave. Alcohol intake didn't matter at all until people were super drunk. Was kind of a surprise. I thought there could be like a linear trend, or maybe even you went from like not at all to a little, and that was the thresholding point, but that's not what happened. So over here, when your resistance goes way, way down, even when you're going to, your ability to resist goes way, way down when you're trying to, only when you had a lot of alcohol.
What constitutes a lot of alcohol?
It was self-reported. It was like a Likert scale.
Okay.
Good question. So what might be for you, then it might be for me. It might be different for you than for me. Okay, and so again, just to kind of wrap up here, in terms of trait self-control, crazy time, we did not see the patterns that we thought that we would. These people with high trait self-control, they have weaker desires, so that's good right off the bat, but then they also find their desires to be less in conflict with their other goals. Maybe that's kind of just something that's a neutral perspective, but they actually engage in less resistance. Perfectionism are tortured souls. They are walking around feeling conflicted and using a lot of self-control in their lives. BIS and BAS, we were surprised about this. Again, we had some more sophisticated ideas about the way these processes might work, but in the end, they seem to really correspond mainly to desire strength and then whether you actually perform behaviors. And so if we were to take our data, and I know this is like, it doesn't like, if you were trying to be like a really serious scientist, you can't really extrapolate to 16 hours a day, but if you did, then we would say that because on 50% of the occasions we meet people, they experience desire. So 8 hours a day, we're experiencing desire. And then we use 3.5 hours a day trying to battle back against those urges that we don't want to give into. And then we have this glorious half an hour of succumbing to the urges that we've been trying to resist. And so I think I'll just end it at that. Thank you.